The air inside the Fort Bragg training facility didn't just carry tension, it carried the weight of institutional history. It was October 1972, a transition point for the American military, still reeling from the complexities of Southeast Asia and grappling with a changing social landscape. Inside the specialized hand-to-hand combat bay, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of canvas mats, acrid gun oil, and the sharp, ozone-like electricity that precedes a violent storm. Bruce Lee stood near a rack of wooden practice rifles, his black training clothes a stark silhouette against the drab, olive-drab surroundings. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a clinical, unforgiving glow on everything. He had been invited through unofficial channels, a professional courtesy for a military liaison who believed that the next generation of special operations could learn from the unconventional. To most of the world, Bruce was the star of the big boss, a blur of kinetic energy on a cinema screen. To the men and women in this room, they were a variable they hadn't yet solved. He looked smaller than he did on screen, leaner, almost delicate until you looked at his hands. His knuckles were flat, his forearms corded with muscle that seemed to wrap around the bone like steel cable. He wasn't just standing, he was inhabiting the space, his presence filling the room with a quiet, vibrating intensity. But Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Vance wasn't interested in solving variables. She was interested in constants. Vance leaned against a cinder-block wall, her arms crossed over a chest that bore the unmistakable, rigid posture of a career officer. At 5'10" and 165 pounds, she was a masterpiece of functional biology. Her strength wasn't the vanity muscle of a bodybuilder. It was the dense, wiry power of a woman who had spent 18 years outrunning, outlifting, and outthinking her male counterparts. Her journey from the enlisted ranks to battalion command was a trail of broken glass and shattered expectations. She had scars on her knuckles, not from barroom brawls, but from decades of refusing to yield an inch in a world that demanded she give a mile. Her jaw worked rhythmically on a piece of gum, a restless habit born of high-stress environments. Her eyes, as sharp and gray as a bayonet, never left Lee. To her, he was Hollywood. He was a civilian who taught movie stars how to simulate danger. She had heard the whispers that his speed was supernatural, that he had humbled masters behind closed doors. But Vance didn't live in the world of whispers. She lived in the world of the U.S. Army's physical readiness test. In Vance's world, you were the sum of your metrics, the number of miles run under a heavy ruck, the count of consecutive push-ups, the seconds on a stopwatch during an obstacle course. Everything was documented, everything was replicable, everything was quantifiable. And Bruce Lee, with his fluid grace and philosophical musings, represented everything she found suspicious. The session had begun quietly. Bruce was working with a young female lieutenant, correcting the distribution of her weight during a lead leg kick. His voice was professorial, calm, patient, and devoid of the drill sergeant bark that echoed in these halls. "Efficiency," Bruce said, his hands lightly guiding the lieutenant's hips. "Don't think about the target as something to hit. Think about the target as something to go through. Your body is a tool for the transmission of force. If there is tension in your shoulder, the force is trapped. It never reaches the end of the tool. Lieutenant, if you want the force to be great, you need the acceleration to be unimpeded by your own internal resistance." His movements were terrifyingly economical. No theatrical flourishes, no karate poses, just a series of micro-adjustments that made the lieutenant's strikes suddenly double in velocity. He demonstrated a simple lead jab. To the untrained eye, it looked like a flicker. To the special forces operators in the room, it was a revelation. He didn't chamber his fist. He didn't telegraph with his hips. His hand simply was there, inches from the target before their brains had registered that he had moved. Vance watched, her mind a cold computer. He's fast, she conceded, but speed is a luxury of the unencumbered. Put 60 pounds of gear on him and drop him in a swamp, and let's see how efficient his physics are. This isn't a movie set. This is a factory for violence. The observers, 4 Green Berets, 3 female officers, and Captain Rebecca Morrison, the intelligence liaison, exchanged glances. The Green Berets were skeptical, but intrigued. They had seen masters before, men who claimed to have death touches and secret techniques, only to fold the moment a real fight turned into a wrestling match on the ground. But Bruce didn't talk about secrets. He talked about anatomy. He talked about the shortest distance between 2 points. When the session paused for a water break, the silence in the room became heavy. The hum of the building's ventilation system felt louder, a low-frequency drone that signaled the end of the educational portion of the morning. Vance pushed off the wall. The rhythmic thud-thud of her combat boots on the mat sounded like a countdown. She walked with the gait of someone who owned the ground she stepped on. "So you're the famous Bruce Lee," Vance said, stopping exactly 6 feet away. This was the kill zone in most combative systems, the distance from which a strike could be launched in a fraction of a second. She knew this. She was testing him. Bruce took a sip of water and draped a white towel over his shoulder. He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, his expression was a blank slate. "People tell many stories, Colonel. Most of them are for their own benefit, not mine." "They say you're fast," Vance continued, her eyes sweeping over him, performing a tactical assessment. She looked at the slope of his shoulders, the length of his reach, the way his weight was distributed. "They say you've beaten men twice your size. They say you can do things that don't make sense according to conventional training. The conventional is often just a comfortable ceiling we build for ourselves," Bruce replied quietly. "Once you realize the ceiling isn't there, things start to make sense. It is like water, Colonel. If you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put it in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. Conventional training is the bottle. I prefer to be the water." Vance's lips thinned. "I'm a practical woman, Mr. Lee. I've spent 18 years in an institution that doesn't care about the shape of the bottle. It cares about how much water is inside to keep the troops alive. We measure what is real. I don't believe in mystique. I believe in what can be tested and replicated under controlled conditions." "Then we have much in common," Bruce said, stepping away from the equipment rack. "I also value the test, but perhaps we are measuring different things. You measure the capacity of the vessel. I measure the flow." Vance took a half step closer. She was now well within his reach, her presence imposing. "I see a civilian who teaches choreography, someone who has never had to carry a dying soldier 3 miles through a jungle while taking fire. I see someone who has never had to make a decision that results in a body bag. I think women like me spend every day of our lives proving we belong here. We earn our respect through documented performance. And then people like you walk in draped in legend and get handed respect you haven't bled for. I want to see the reality behind the legend." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Captain Morrison stepped forward, sensing the escalating friction. "Colonel, perhaps we should get back to the curriculum. Mr. Lee is here on a limited schedule." "It's fine, Captain," Bruce interrupted. His gaze remained locked on Vance. He saw the armor she wore, not just the uniform, but the psychological plating she had forged to survive a male-dominated hierarchy. He saw the need to be better, faster, and stronger than everyone else just to earn the right to stand in the room. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a mirror of his own struggle for recognition in a world that saw him as other. "The Colonel has questions," Bruce said softly, "and in my experience, some questions can only be answered through direct contact." Vance began unbuttoning her uniform jacket. Underneath, she wore a standard-issue olive tank top. Her shoulders were broad, her triceps defined like braided cord. She didn't look like an actress. She looked like a weapon.
She removed her watch, her rings, and finally her boots, standing on the mat in her socks. "If I beat you," Vance said, her voice echoing off the cinder blocks, "I want it known that your system is just theater. I'll report to the liaison that your concepts are unsuitable for military application. But if you beat me, I'll stand in front of every soldier on this post and admit I was wrong. I'll tell them you're exactly what the stories say." "I don't need an apology," Bruce said, his stance opening up slightly, though he still looked remarkably casual. "I am not here to take your pride. I am here to share a truth. But if these are your terms, I accept." Bruce handed his towel to the young lieutenant. He didn't stretch, he didn't bounce, he simply walked to the center of the mat to face her. He stood in what he called the small phasing stance, lead hand out, lead foot slightly forward, his body coiled but appearing relaxed. Vance didn't hesitate. She wasn't a brawler, she was a tactician. She dropped into a textbook combative